Hello, my name is Matthew Petrie, and for my student lecture, I will be talking about the Great Northern War, which lasted from the year 1700 until the year 1721, as well as the Swedish Army during the Great Northern War. I would like to start my presentation with a summary of the Great Northern War. The Great Northern War, as I said in the title, was a conflict that lasted from 1700 until 1721. The war was fought in northern, central, and eastern Europe. The war was between the Swedish Empire under the rule of King Charles XII and a coalition of European powers, including Peter I of Russia, also becoming known as Peter the Great after the war ended, Frederick IV of Denmark, Norway, and Augustus II the Strong of Saxony, Poland, Lithuania, plus other European powers who joined in the later years, such as Brandenburg, Prussia, and Hanover. Frederick and Augustus would both be defeated and drop out of the war in 1700 and 1706 respectively, but would both rejoin in 1709 after Charles XII suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Poltava. The Swedish also had some allies in the form of some Polish-Lithuanian magnates from 1704 to 1710, and some Cossacks from Ukraine from 1708 to 1710. And the Ottoman Empire briefly intervened on the behalf of Charles and sheltered him from Russia after his defeat at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. I will now provide a background of the Great Northern War. And to start off with, I will say one of the reasons for the war was Peter I's desire to capture territory on the Baltic Sea to build a port to allow Russia to easily trade with the rest of Europe. The war also began because Russia thought Charles XII, who was only 14 at the time when he ascended the Swedish throne in 1697, would be too weak to fight back. All the other powers had their own reasons for going to war, but I think a main reason was the weakness that Russia had sensed must have been sensed by other European powers as well. I will now explain some key battles of the Great Northern War, and I will preface this by saying there were many battles during the Great Northern War, but I have decided to talk about the three battles that I think were the most important. And those were the Battle of Narva on November 20th, 1700, the Battle of Frostad on February 3rd, 1706, and the Battle of Poltava on July 8th, 1709. I will now talk about the first of the three battles I wanted to talk about, or the Battle of Narva. The battle was fought, as I previously said, on November 20th, 1700, against Peter the First Russian army, although Peter the First, or Peter the Great as he became known following the end of the Great Northern War, as I stated in an earlier slide, wasn't present at the battle, having left the day before. The battle took place outside the Swedish fortress of Narva. The Russians, with an army of 35,000 to 38,000 men, had been laying siege to Narva since September. When Charles XII arrived with his army of only 10,537 men, he made a risky choice to attack the entrenched Russian army. His attack was aided by the fact that the entrenchments the Russians had were too large to properly defend, and there was a snowstorm blowing in the face of the Russians that was dramatically decreasing their visibility at the time of the Swedish attack. The Russians suffered around 18,000 casualties, and the Swedes suffered 667 killed and 1,247 wounded. The Swedes allowed the Russian soldiers to leave, but took the officers prisoner. Charles would then spend the rest of the winter rebuilding his army for the campaigning season of 1701. Now, the next battle I wanted to talk about, the Battle of Frostad, as I said earlier, was fought on February 3rd, 1706. It was fought between a Swedish army and an army of Saxony, Poland, plus their Russian allies. The Swedes had 9,400 men on the field, and the Saxon, Polish, Russian army had around 20,000 men. The Swedes would lose a total of 1,500 men, while the Saxon, Polish, Russian army would lose about 15,000 men, and the battle was a Swedish victory. Not only a victory, it was a pretty crushing victory. And one of the bigger victories that Charles XII's army Although he wasn't present at the battle was actually the Swedish commander at the battle was one of Charles XII's subordinates. Now, the third of the three battles I wanted to talk about, which was the Battle of Poltava, as I said previously, was fought on July 8th, 1709. It was fought between Charles XII's Swedish army as well as some Cossacks under Ivan Mazepa and the Russian army. The Swedes had up to 30,000 men, including allies, but only 16,500 men fought, and the Russians had 75,000 men, but only 42,000 fought in the battle. The Swedes lost 6,900 men killed and wounded, and they lost 2,800 men captured, whereas the Russians would lose only 1,345 men killed and 3,290 men wounded. I now want to explain the Swedish army during the Great Northern War as an overview. When Charles XII became king, he inherited an army of 65,000 men, and the Swedes, due to a limited population, had to rely on multiple methods of recruitment, such as provincial regiments and enlisted regiments. Provincial regiments were recruited from provinces, and enlisted regiments were full of men recruited for a certain sum of money. Recruitment of new troops had to be approved by Parliament, just like ordinary taxation. The recruitment system was limited because the number of recruits from different regions was a fixed amount and could not be raised in times of war. All officers were native Swedes, which was different from how other powers did things at the time. After the end of the Great Northern War, the Swedish army was reorganized and reduced, and Sweden ceased to be a major European power. I will now explain the Swedish Army infantry forces and how they were organized in their organization during the Great Northern War. The standard infantry regiment had 1,200 men in 8 150-man companies, but in battle they were arranged into 2 600-man battalions. The largest infantry regiment was of the Guard, which had a peak strength of 2,592 men, with 24 108-man companies, but 4 battalions, including 1 grenadier battalion. 1/3 of the infantry would have pikes, and the other 2/3 had muskets. But as the war went on, the numbers changed as the emphasis shifted to focusing more on muskets. I now want to move on and talk about the Swedish Army cavalry forces and how they were organized. And during the Great Northern War, most Swedish cavalry regiments had 1,000 men with 8 companies of 125 men, and a single cavalry squadron was made up of 2 companies, or in other words, each cavalry regiment would have 4 squadrons. Although during wartime, the size of these units was often doubled. Or in other words, whereas in peacetime, you might have a cavalry regiment with 1,000 men. During wartime, that might be doubled to 2,000. I will now talk about the end of the Great Northern War. The Great Northern War's end started in 1719 with the Treaties of Stockholm with the German states of Hanover and Brandenburg, Prussia, would continue to wind down after the Treaty of Fredericksburg with the Danes in 1720, and the war would ultimately conclude with the Treaty of Nystad with the Russians in 1721. Now, as my final summary, when the Great Northern War began, Sweden was at the peak of their power, and by the end of the Great Northern War, Sweden was no longer a great power. This is my list of sources for the information that I used in my presentation. These are the sources for the 3 images that I used during my presentation, all of which were battle maps for the 3 battles that I explained in some earlier slides. And before I sign off, I want to say thank you for for listening, and I hope you found this presentation full of information. So with that, I will now say good day.